You alluded to it a little bit, but I want you to tell me a little bit more and tell us a little bit more in detail your government Hickenlooper's plan to increase the revenue stream into Colorado for everything that ultimately will help public education.
It's a fair question. We had a cabinet meeting today. We have them frequently, and we're talking about, what does the future hold for Colorado? I think we have a good governor, and I think my colleagues on the cabinet are outstanding individuals, and yet we all sort of wring our hands a little bit about this resource issue. What the governor has said repeatedly, during the year plus that he spent campaigning, he traveled throughout the state, and what he heard over and over again is, frankly, that there is no appetite right now for raising taxes. Okay, well, if there isn't, how do we change that? How do we begin to tell the story? And what we talked about today was, how do we involve communities, citizens, to help us think about what we want the Colorado of the future to look like? And if we say this is what we want, then we need to have an honest conversation about how we pay for it. I think it's too easy for people on the outside to simply say, I already pay too much in taxes, and of course they're thinking about the feds. They think they pay too much, and they think there's too much, and they always talk about the fraud, waste, and abuse. Well, frankly, if it was that easy to find fraud, waste, and abuse, we'd find it, we'd eliminate it. We'd rather spend money on other things. It's simply not the case. In your schools, there may be some things you think, we could do this a little bit differently, we might save a little bit of money, but rarely would it be enough money to hire another professional. There's just not much there. So we've got to engage the public. We've got to ask them, what do you want? What do you want out of Colorado? And then let's talk about what that's going to cost. Until we do that, we could go out now and try to put something on the ballot. But frankly, the governor doesn't think, and I hate to agree with him, but on this I have to, that we don't think people will vote for it. They tell us, we've done all kinds of polling, everything turns up negative. Whether we're talking about transportation and increasing the gas tax, Coloradans are overwhelmingly, 90% opposed to the idea of increased gas taxes. We see that to a lesser extent around public education, to a greater extent around higher education, but right now people just aren't there, and we have to bring them there. We cannot, from the top down, say, we know we need more money, give it to us, because it ain't going to happen that way. So the long term, the plan, and we're beginning now, is to go out to communities and say, tell us what's working in your community, tell us what you'd like to see in your community, and then let's talk about what's that going to cost and where's that money going to come from.
So I'm going to Chase and ask you a question about three elements. How do you and the governor feel about TABOR?
We both say, neither of us are fans of TABOR. Now, I made the mistake of leaving the private practice of law and getting into state government the year after TABOR was passed. It's bad planning on my part. But TABOR may be the source of the problems we've faced in past years, but right now, TABOR isn't the problem this year or last year, because what TABOR prevents us from doing is keeping tax revenue above a certain growth amount. But we haven't had that growth. Now, what TABOR also does, though, of course, it keeps us from raising any taxes without a vote of the people, and when the economy goes down, we have that ratchet effect that keeps us from recovering quickly. So, I met today with someone, a lawyer who's working with a law firm that challenged the law, that is challenging the constitutionality of TABOR. And I think, everybody thinks that may be a bit of a long shot, but at this point, we've got to try something. But it's not just TABOR. It's the Gallagher Amendment as well. There are other conflicting constitutional amendments that have put fiscal handcuffs on this state that your legislators, whether they love K-12 education or not, they can't fix. They get frustrated because they have absolutely no flexibility when it comes to setting the state budget, the state's budget. The budget is on autopilot, and it's in a downward spiral. So that's, honestly, hate it. Hate it. I'd vote against it. I'd vote to repeal it. I'd do everything I can.
My question is around the asset bill. We have invested our K-12 education in a lot of students who, by the time they graduate, do not have the opportunities that are afforded to them, or that we lose if they decide to go out of state because they're not able to go to the state, or they may be the top of their class, but then they're limited by their choices by the time they graduate. These are students who, for no other reason, are bound by their history. And how do we get the public to really start thinking about that Colorado for all of our students, not just select students? In the midst of the region that's around us, even Texas is able to grant, in light of the DREAM Act coming back around again, how do we make sure that these groups of students and the future are not forgotten and not let go? Because they are here and we owe them the same thing.
It's very frustrating that we're in the situation we're in now. When I was president at CSU Puebla, I would get calls routinely every year from people I knew in DPS and another district saying, you got to help. We've got this young man, this young woman who's a valedictorian, who's in the top 10, who has a 4.5 GPA, who's been a student body president, who has nowhere to go. What can you do? And my answer is generally nothing. Because in this state, you know the law, and that is that we cannot allow them to pay resident tuition. Now, it was a very clever bill this time around that was carried by some good friends of mine. It said, okay, we don't want to listen to that taxpayer argument, so we'll say only unsubsidized student tuition. And the colleges and universities supported it. If we have capacity, why wouldn't we take one of those students? We're not getting less money from that student. We're being fully compensated the same way we are for any other student, because they not only would have to pay resident tuition, but they'd have to pay the state general fund support, what we call the College Opportunity Fund stipend. They'd have to pay that, so they would be paying more than a resident student, but less than a non-resident student. I think that was a great idea. It didn't go anywhere. And well, it got further than it has in the past, but the elected officials just heard too much from their constituents that if you vote for this, we will make sure you lose your next election. And they would argue that. They would ignore the facts entirely and say, how can we afford to do this? If we don't have enough money, this is just costing the state more money. It is not costing the state more money. Where I was at CSU Pueblo, where we had capacity, say, bring them in. They will help cover the cost, the fixed costs we have here. And they are good, hardworking students who will elevate what we do here. Didn't work. I think it will come back every year. I don't know when it will be successful, but I think until your elected officials hear from you that this is important and positive, they will only be hearing from those other folks, the uninformed folks, who are saying it's terrible and it's bad and you're rewarding criminals. That's what they're hearing. They need to hear from the other side, or the result's going to be the same year after year.
I'm hoping you might be able to address it a little from a higher ed standpoint and maybe get some sort of emphasis on the mediation rate and another metric in measuring how our students are doing. Because they might be getting a piece of paper, but the pressure, is kind of are they learning versus are they getting the credit? And so that's just like the
huge issue. That's what I spent all morning talking about at this ACT conference. And I hear that, when we want to increase graduation rates at colleges and universities, and when I push my former colleagues, the college and university presidents, and say, we've got to bump those graduation rates, they say, oh, what you're telling me is I've got to do away with rigor. I've just got to pass people through. No, we are counting on the integrity of educators to hold students to high standards. We do want students to graduate, but we want them to graduate with a degree that means something. And it won't if you're just passing them through. And if your building administrator is telling you we need to boost graduation rates, so don't flunk kids just because they never do any work, well, we don't want that person as a building administrator, and I would hope that... But we've got to figure out, when we say to higher education folks as well, we take a community colleges, they're open enrollment. They say we get a lot of students who are completely unprepared. But at CSU Puebla, we get kids who are unprepared. But if we're admitting those kids and we're taking their money, then we've got to figure out what we can do to help them be successful. And that doesn't mean pass them if they don't do any work. It means figuring out what we can do to get them the counseling, academic advising, everything they need in order to get over what should be a very high bar. And I recognize that people feel that when we're emphasizing graduation rates, whether we're talking about from the K-12 system or higher ed, people can read that as, we want you to pass everything. That's not what we want, that's not what you want. But we do know that remediation rates for students arriving at higher ed, 30% of the students need remediation. At the community college, it's much higher than that. But even at CU, at our flagship, we have students arrive needing remediation. And what that, I think, reflects more than anything is the historical lack of cooperation and communication between higher ed and the K-12 system. We tell you in higher ed, we tell K-12, you're not doing a good enough job of preparing our kids, and K-12 pushes back and says, well, you haven't told us exactly what you want. Our curriculum is not necessarily aligned. Or when we say, you're doing a terrible job of teaching these kids, who's teaching them? And K-12 says, well, those are the teachers you produced at your institution, in your teacher education program. So you're not teaching them the right things there. So we do need to have a more clear linkage between K-12 and higher education, and not simply where we're handing off students at some point, but where we are coming as higher ed into the K-12 system and saying, helping to identify and remediate those students before they leave, and to motivate those students and get them thinking about higher education early on in their academic career.
Well, thank you so much, Lieutenant Governor. We really appreciate your time. We really appreciate your energy and the passion you bring to both your positions. And thank you for spending some time with us today.
Thank you.